On a quiet Sunday evening in May of 2005, as families across America gathered to celebrate Mother's Day, two little girls climbed onto a single bicycle in a working-class neighborhood just north of Chicago. They were best friends, one was 8, the other 9, and they had no idea that within hours, their names would be etched into one of Illinois' most haunting cold cases. But here's where this story takes a turn that no one saw coming. The man who would spend the next 5 years in prison for their brutal murders was completely innocent. And the real killer? He was living just down the street, watching the chaos unfold, before quietly slipping away to join the United States Marine Corps. This is the story of Laura Hobbs, Crystal Tobias, and a justice system that failed everyone involved. Zion, Illinois doesn't look like the kind of place where nightmares happen. It's a modest suburb about 40 miles north of Chicago, nestled near the shores of Lake Michigan. The kind of town where neighbors wave from their porches and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. In May of 2005, spring had finally settled over the Midwest, and the community was enjoying one of those perfect late spring evenings, warm enough to be outside, cool enough to be comfortable. Laura Hobbs was 8 years old, a spirited little girl with her whole life ahead of her. She lived with her mother, and her father Jerry had recently come back into her life after a stint in a Texas prison. It wasn't a perfect family situation, few are, but Jerry was trying to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. He'd made mistakes in his past, including a bizarre incident involving a chainsaw during a trailer park dispute, drug charges, and some domestic troubles. But he loved Laura, and he was determined to be present in her life again. Crystal Tobias was 9, Laura's neighbor and closest friend. The two girls were practically inseparable that spring, doing what kids do, playing in the yard, riding bikes, dreaming about summer vacation. Crystal had an older brother, and the Tobias family lived just down the street from the Hobbs household. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where kids could run between houses without their parents worrying too much. On May 8, 2005, Mother's Day, Laura was technically grounded. Her mother believed she'd stolen $40 from her purse, and the punishment was supposed to keep her inside. But Laura was 8 years old, and the pull of a beautiful spring evening was stronger than any parental decree. When Crystal came by, the two girls decided to take a bike ride around the neighborhood. They shared a single bicycle, one pedaling while the other balanced on the handlebars or the back pegs. It was innocent, spontaneous, the kind of thing kids do without thinking twice. As the sun began to set over Zion, the girls pedaled toward Beulah Park, a wooded preserve at the edge of the neighborhood. The trees there were thick, the trails winding and secluded. It was a place where local kids played, where teenagers sometimes hung out after dark. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody imagined that the shadows between those trees held something monstrous waiting. The evening grew darker. Dinner time came and went. Laura and Crystal didn't come home. At first, the families weren't overly alarmed. Kids lose track of time. They get caught up playing and forget to come home when they're supposed to. But as the hours stretched on and the sky turned black, worry began to set in. Laura's mother started making phone calls. Crystal's family checked with neighbors. Nobody had seen the girls since late afternoon. By nightfall, the search had grown from a few concerned family members to dozens of volunteers combing the streets of Zion. They checked playgrounds, knocked on doors, called out the girls' names into the darkness. Jerry Hobbs, Laura's father, was among the most desperate searchers. He'd been awake for hours, walking the streets, checking every corner, every shadow. The man hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, his daughter was missing, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The search continued through the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness of Beulah Park. Voices echoed between the trees. And still, nothing. No sign of the girls. No abandoned bicycle. No clues at all. The community held its breath, hoping for the best but fearing the worst. Mother's Day had turned into every parent's nightmare. The sun rose on May 9, 2005, casting pale light through the trees of Beulah Park. Jerry Hobbs had been awake for nearly 48 hours at this point, running on adrenaline and terror. He'd barely eaten, hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red, his mind racing with horrible possibilities. As morning broke, he pushed deeper into the wooded preserve, searching areas that hadn't been thoroughly checked the night before. And then he found them. In a small clearing among the trees, Jerry Hobbs discovered the bodies of his daughter Laura and her best friend Crystal Tobias. They were lying side by side, facing upward, their shoes placed neatly nearby. It was immediately clear that something horrific had happened here. Both girls had been stabbed multiple times, their small bodies bearing wounds to their necks, faces, and torsos. Laura had been stabbed more than 20 times. Crystal had been stabbed 11 times. The violence was beyond comprehension. But there was something else about the scene that would later become crucial to understanding what really happened here. The bodies appeared to have been staged. Arranged. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a frenzied attack, it was deliberate, almost ritualistic. The girls had been undressed and then redressed. Their bodies had been positioned carefully, laid out as if on display. And forensic examination would later reveal the unthinkable: both children had been sexually assaulted. Jerry Hobbs's screams brought other searchers running. Within minutes, the wooded clearing in Beulah Park had transformed into a crime scene. Police cars arrived with their lights flashing. Yellow tape went up between the trees. Detectives began documenting every inch of the area. And Jerry Hobbs, exhausted, traumatized, barely coherent, was taken in for questioning. Here's where the story takes its first devastating turn. From the moment police arrived at that crime scene, Jerry Hobbs became their primary suspect. On paper, it made a certain kind of sense. He was the one who found the bodies, and in criminal investigations, the person who discovers the victim is always looked at closely. He had a criminal record that included violence. And he was a family member, which statistically made him more likely to be involved in a child's death. But Jerry Hobbs had just spent 48 hours searching desperately for his daughter. He'd walked miles through the streets of Zion, called her name until his voice was hoarse, and then discovered her murdered body in the woods. He was shattered, broken, operating on no sleep and pure grief. And instead of being treated as a grieving father, he was treated as a suspect. The interrogation began almost immediately and lasted for 20 hours. 20 hours of questioning, of police pressure, of psychological manipulation designed to break down a man who was already broken. Jerry was exhausted beyond comprehension. He was traumatized. He was confused. And slowly, methodically, the interrogators worked to convince him that he must have done this, that he must have killed his own daughter in a fit of rage because she'd broken her grounding and gone out on her bicycle. And after 20 hours, Jerry Hobbs confessed. It wasn't a detailed confession. It wasn't coherent or consistent with the evidence. In fact, the police typed it up themselves and simply had Jerry sign it. The story they put together claimed that Jerry had snapped when he found Laura out riding her bike instead of staying home as punishment. That he'd attacked both girls in a moment of uncontrollable fury. That he'd stabbed Laura 20 times and Crystal 11 times because of a $40 theft. But here's what that confession couldn't explain: the sexual assault. The ritualistic staging of the bodies. The careful, deliberate arrangement of the crime scene. The fact that Jerry had no blood on his clothing despite allegedly committing one of the most violent double murders in Lake County history. His claim that he'd cleaned himself with alcohol was forensically absurd. Blood isn't alcohol soluble. None of it made sense. But Jerry Hobbs had confessed, and in the American justice system, a confession is often treated as the end of the investigation rather than a piece of evidence to be verified. On May 11, 2005, Jerry Hobbs was arrested and charged with the first-degree murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. The case, as far as the Lake County State's attorney was concerned, was closed. Jerry Hobbs sat in Lake County Jail, awaiting trial for the murder of his own daughter. Outside those walls, the media had already convicted him. Nancy Grace, the famous CNN legal analyst known for her aggressive prosecution-friendly commentary, declared his guilt on national television. She was so confident that she made an on-air bet, promising to eat a dirt sandwich if physical evidence didn't support the conviction. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict: Jerry Hobbs was a monster who had killed 2 innocent children. But behind the scenes, something wasn't right. And a dedicated public defender named Dave Bailey was determined to find out what. The first red flag came from the DNA evidence. When forensic technicians examined samples taken from the crime scene, including material found under the girls' fingernails, they discovered male DNA that didn't match Jerry Hobbs. This should have been explosive. This should have stopped everything. But the prosecution had an answer: Jerry had already confessed, so the DNA must be from some unrelated source. Maybe a previous boyfriend. Maybe someone who had touched the girls innocently before the crime. The confession trumped everything. Dave Bailey wasn't satisfied. He spent countless hours analyzing crime scene photographs, zooming in pixel by pixel, studying every detail. What he saw didn't match the story of a frenzied, rage-fueled attack by an out-of-control father. The stab wounds showed a distinctive pattern. The killer had hesitated, made 2 shallow punctures, then delivered a full thrust. This suggested someone methodical, someone who had to work up the nerve to kill. The wounds to Laura's face, particularly around her eyes, were precise and deliberate, not wild and chaotic. And then there was the staging, the bodies arranged side by side, the clothing removed and replaced, the shoes positioned neatly nearby. This was ritualistic behavior, the signature of someone who had thought about this, planned this, perhaps even fantasized about it. In 2008, Bailey's team submitted biological samples to Seri Labs, a private forensic laboratory in California. What they found changed everything. The local crime lab had only detected partial DNA under the girls' fingernails. But Seri Labs found full spermatozoa DNA in samples taken from Laura Hobbs's body. Vaginal, anal, and oral swabs all contained genetic material from an unknown male. And that male was definitively not Jerry Hobbs. This was proof. Absolute, scientific proof that someone else had sexually assaulted Laura Hobbs before her death. This evidence was presented to the prosecution in 2008. And do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The Lake County State's Attorney's Office sat on this exculpatory evidence for an entire year, taking no action, pursuing no alternative suspects, leaving an innocent man to rot in jail. By 2010, Jerry Hobbs had been imprisoned for 5 years without a trial. 5 years of his life stolen. 5 years of being called a monster, a child killer, the worst thing a human being can be. But Dave Bailey and his defense team hadn't given up. They filed motions demanding that the DNA evidence be run through the FBI's national database. They subpoenaed federal agencies. They pushed and pushed against a system that seemed determined to keep Jerry Hobbs behind bars. And then came the breakthrough. When the local crime lab finally resubmitted the DNA profile to the FBI database, they discovered that they had made a critical error years earlier. Someone had transposed the numbers in the genetic profile, a clerical mistake that had prevented any match from being found. When the corrected profile was submitted, the database returned a hit almost immediately. The DNA belonged to a man named Jorge Avila Torres. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. Jorge Avila Torres had been living just down the street from the Hobbs and Tobias families in May of 2005. He was 16 years old at the time of the murders, a teenager who knew the neighborhood, knew the families, and was friends with Crystal Tobias's older brother. He had access. He had opportunity. And he had something else that nobody knew about at the time. He was a sexual predator with violent fantasies that he was just beginning to act upon. The DNA match to Jorge Avila Torres opened a window into a nightmare that extended far beyond Zion, Illinois. After murdering Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias in May of 2005, Torres had simply walked away. He continued living his life, graduated from high school, and in a twist that defies comprehension, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. While Jerry Hobbs sat in a jail cell being vilified as a child killer, the actual murderer was wearing the uniform of his country. Torres was stationed at Joint Base Maya Henderson Hall in Arlington County, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. He worked as a clerk, passing through security checkpoints at the Pentagon, surrounded by America's military leadership. Nobody suspected anything. Nobody had any idea that they were working alongside a man who had brutally murdered 2 children and would soon kill again. In 2009, Torres struck again. His victim this time was Amanda Snell, a 20-year-old Navy petty officer second class who worked in military intelligence. Torres strangled her to death in the barracks. It was his second known murder, committed 4 years after the Zion killings, and once again, he got away with it. The investigation went cold. Amanda Snell's killer remained unknown. But Jorge Avila Torres' luck was about to run out. In February of 2010, Torres kidnapped 2 women in Northern Virginia. He raped one of them and left her for dead on the side of a road. But she survived. Badly injured and traumatized, she was able to identify her attacker. Police arrested Torres, and for the first time, his DNA was entered into the national database. Within weeks, that DNA profile matched the unknown male from the Zion murders. And suddenly, everything changed. While awaiting trial in Virginia, Torres was housed with another inmate, a man named Osama El Atari, a former restaurateur who had been convicted of defrauding banks out of $53 million. What Torres didn't know was that El Atari had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was wearing a wire. The recordings that El Atari captured are chilling. In conversation after conversation, Jorge Avila Torres talked about his crimes with a casualness that defies human understanding. He admitted to killing the 2 girls in Zion. He admitted to murdering Amanda Snell. And when El Atari asked if he felt any remorse for what he'd done, Torres said no. He laughed about the Zion killings. He showed no emotion, no guilt, no recognition that he had destroyed multiple families and ended 3 innocent lives. On August 3, 2010, Jerry Hobbs walked out of Lake County Jail a free man. After 5 years of imprisonment, 5 years of being called a monster, 5 years of having his name dragged through the mud on national television, he was finally exonerated. The state dropped all charges. Dave Bailey, the public defender who had never stopped fighting, personally drove Jerry back to his hometown in Texas. It was over, at least for Jerry. For Jorge Avila Torres, justice was just beginning. In October 2010, he was convicted of the Virginia rape and kidnapping charges and sentenced to 5 life terms plus 168 years in prison. In April 2014, a federal jury convicted him of Amanda Snell's murder and sentenced him to death, the first federal death sentence handed down since 2007. And in September 2018, Torres finally pleaded guilty to the Zion murders, receiving an additional 100-year sentence. At his sentencing for the Zion killings, Judge Daniel Shaines looked at Jorge Avila Torres and spoke words that echoed the feelings of everyone who had followed this case. "You are a serial killer," the judge said. "And if you had even a spark of goodness, it was so far out of your reach that it was unattainable." Jerry Hobbs eventually received a settlement of approximately $7.5 million for the years he lost and the nightmare he endured. But money can't give back 5 years of life. Money can't erase the trauma of being accused of murdering your own child. Money can't undo the damage done by a justice system that valued a coerced confession over physical evidence. The Lake County State's Attorney's Office faced scrutiny for their handling of the case, but no one was criminally charged for the misconduct that kept an innocent man imprisoned while a serial killer roamed free. It later emerged that Jerry Hobbs's case wasn't an isolated incident. At least 5 men had spent a combined 80 years in Lake County jails despite DNA evidence suggesting their innocence. The system that failed Jerry Hobbs had failed many others before him. In December 2024, as part of a mass commutation, President Joe Biden converted Jorge Avila Torres' federal death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who murdered 2 little girls on Mother's Day, who strangled a young Navy officer in her barracks, who raped and nearly killed multiple women in Virginia, will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, but he will not face execution. This case haunts everyone who studies it, and it should haunt all of us. It's a story about how quickly the justice system can go wrong when investigators become convinced they have their man. It's about the terrifying power of false confessions, how a traumatized, sleep-deprived person can be manipulated into admitting to something they didn't do. It's about DNA evidence and how it can both condemn the guilty and save the innocent, but only if someone is willing to look at it honestly. And it's about the victims who are so often forgotten in these cases. Laura Hobbs was 8 years old. She liked riding her bicycle and spending time with her best friend. Crystal Tobias was 9. She had dreams and hopes and a whole life ahead of her. They deserved justice, and for 5 long years, they didn't get it, because the system was so focused on punishing the wrong man that it forgot to look for the right one. Maybe the most disturbing thing about this case is how easily it could have ended differently. If Jorge Avila Torres hadn't been arrested in Virginia in 2010, his DNA never would have entered the national database. Illinois didn't collect DNA at the time of arrest, only after conviction. If Torres had been more careful, if his surviving victim hadn't been able to identify him, Jerry Hobbs might still be sitting in prison today, convicted of a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer lived free. Sometimes justice isn't about the system working. Sometimes it's about luck, timing, and the stubborn determination of a few people who refuse to accept an easy answer. Dave Bailey, the public defender who spent years fighting for Jerry Hobbs, is one of those people. The surviving victim in Virginia, who had the courage to report her attacker, is another. Without them, this story would have a very different ending. On quiet evenings in Zion, Illinois, you can still walk through Beulah Park. The trees are still there, the trails still wind through the woods, and families still bring their children to play. Most of them don't know what happened in that clearing in May of 2005. Most of them have never heard the names Laura Hobbs or Crystal Tobias. But the shadows remember. And somewhere in those woods, two little girls who just wanted to ride their bicycle on Mother's Day are still waiting for someone to tell their story. This is that story. And now you know it too. The Zion girls' murder case remains one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in American history, cited by the Innocence Project and legal scholars as an example of how coerced confessions and prosecutorial tunnel vision can destroy innocent lives while allowing the guilty to escape justice.